The other day, I noticed.
I just started it. So, this is about this.
Oh, but this is a question about the Kedusha.
All right. So, we're going to learn now another part of the Farbrengen, where that discusses.
Sorry, what page are you on?
We're on page Lamed Beis, where that discusses the halacha of where exactly we are meant to begin reading the Megillah. The different parts of the Megillah, different opinions about where the reader should begin from, and why is it that we have to indeed read the entire Megillah, which seems to go against the general principles in the Gemara about how we paskin, how we halacha is usually mandated, that we don't usually follow a mayor against Rabbi Yossi and a mayor against Rabbi Yehuda, and here we do, and we read the entire Megillah. Why is the entire Megillah pertinent? Seemingly, the story of which is pertinent for us is the decree against us and the salvation from that decree. But the beginning of the Megillah, which talks about Achashverosh, and Achashverosh is a king over so many countries, and he made a party, and it's for 180 days, and that whole story seems to be irrelevant to us. So, especially considering that the Talmud says that when Mashiach will come, all of the other stories in the Tanakh won't be relevant. Only the story of Esther will be relevant. And the question is, why is it that even after Mashiach comes, we have to read about Achashverosh and this party, and it's so important, even after Mashiach comes, forever. As Esther requested, because write my story down for all generations. Why is it so important to know about Achashverosh? And what the Rebbe basically explains is that you might think that there are events that happen in the great world out there that don't have connection to Jewish people. You might think that the Jewish people are a minority, and there can be that there's this big factory is made just to produce one little item. And yet, everything that happens in the world is connected to the Jewish people. Even though it seems that Achashverosh is the king of the whole world and seems unrelated to the Jewish people, and yet that is about the Jewish people. And similarly, in our lives, there's a big part of our day which doesn't seem to be doing anything with Judaism, and it may seem that it isn't. And the Megillah is coming to tell us that everything in the whole world is for the sake of Torah and for the Yidden, as we shall see. There's another lesson in the story of Esther, which answers a question about the general perspective, general philosophy of Torah, Jews, and Judaism about the world. Forget about the concept we discussed till now about how anti-Semitism and how the nations consider kindness to be a sin, and that discussion. Since the Jewish people are a minority, and within the Jewish people, those who behave according to the will of Mordechai and Esther are also not the majority. So the question is, how come there's such a big world for the sake of such a small little group, which are acting in sync with the will of Mordechai and Esther? What can this be compared to? To a huge factory, which has many different machines, and it costs lots of money to run this factory. In order to produce one small little thing. Even a human being who is easily prone to make mistakes, there's no room to invest millions of golden coins in order to produce one object that's worth one gold coin. How much more so regarding Hashem, who is perfect in everything he does. There certainly has to be an explanation for creating such a big world for the sake of such a small people that shall live according to Torah mitzvahs. How is it that there's such a big world out there and it's all for the sake of this small group of people who are keeping Torah mitzvahs. How does that make sense? Amid Aleph. To understand, they answered that question by first prefacing two wondrous concepts about the Megillah. There are four opinions about where exactly the reader must begin reading the Megillah on Purim. Shema Yochai says you should start reading the Megillah from the story about Achashverosh sleeping disturbed, because that's when the miracle starts. Rabbi Yossi says the story of the Megillah should begin with the problem. Should talk about the strength of Haman, the power of Haman. That when once we know the power of Haman and the terrible things that were going on, then we'll appreciate the whole Geula. So therefore, that's where the story should start. That's where the reader should begin reading on Purim. Rabbi Yehuda says, don't talk about Haman, talk about Mordechai. Talk about how Hashem prepared the Geula. That's where the story should begin, with the beginning of the Geula, where Hashem has given the Jewish people Mordechai. And their mayor and the halacha is that we read the entire story of the Megillah. Move on, we need to understand daily in order to understand that there was a big problem and how God foiled their plot, and he ruined the thoughts of Haman. It's sufficient to know that the king's sleep was disturbed. If you want to tell us a little bit more, talk about how Haman was there before and how Haman rose to power. If you want to also discuss the greatness of Mordechai, start from Mordechai. Why do we need to know about Achashverosh and all the details of his life when it seems that all that's pertinent to us is a conclusion that he made a decree to destroy the Jewish people? He made this decree to destroy the Jewish people, and it was transformed. And that seems to be the only pertinent part of the story for us. And yet the halacha is you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of the Megillah unless you read the entire story. The question is, why is the whole story important? The question is greater because we don't usually follow the mayor's opinion against Rabbi Yossi. And here, Rabbi Meir usually is not the decisive halacha when he argues with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is. Rabbi Meir is not usually the decisive halacha when he argues against Rabbi Yossi. And here, both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi are arguing against Rabbi Meir, and yet the halacha follows Rabbi Meir, which is against the usual rule of the Talmud. So the question is, why do we read the whole Megillah? And the question is magnified, considering that this halacha is incongruous with the general theme of how halacha is usually followed. But the question is, why have to read the whole Megillah? What's the point? If the question wasn't great enough till now, let's add something to the question. It seems that the only thing that we should be reading is the part of the story that describes the decree against the Jewish people and how that decree was reversed. But our sages say not only do we have to read the whole story, but even after Mashiach will come, all the words of the prophets will be irrelevant. And the only thing that's be important after Mashiach comes is the halachas of the Torah and Megillah Esther. B'bias Mashiach. Mashiach will come. The glory of Hashem will be revealed, and everyone will see Hashem. And there'll be prophecy that's given to all of your sons and daughters. Everyone will have prophecy. Everyone will be able to feel godliness and to hear Hashem's voice. Since prophecy won't be considered something so special, Even your sons and daughters, even children, will also have prophecy. So why do you have to hear about your Yirmiyahu's prophecy when you have your own? They won't be to read the book of the prophets won't be so important because after Mashiach comes, every Jewish child will be a prophet. Megillah Esther, but the Megillah of Esther and halachas will not be considered insignificant. All the books of the prophets will be considered insignificant because every child's a prophet. Yirmiyahu is a prophet. So is Yankel, Shmerel, Beryl, and Lazer, who are in nursery. So the books of the prophets aren't considered so significant after Mashiach comes. But the Megillah of Esther, that's considered significant. The fact that halacha is important after Mashiach comes, of course it's important. You have to know what to do. But what's the reason that out of all the prophecies and all of the writings of the Torah, only the story of Esther will not be considered insignificant and it will have the full importance even after Mashiach comes? It will be considered to be very important after Mashiach comes. Why is that singled out as the only book that is considered important after Mashiach comes? Why is the book of Esther more important than all other books of the prophets?
The book of Esther is not a prophecy. It's a story, it's a lesson.
But it was written with prophecy, no?
It's
It's a holy book. It's written by divine inspiration. So why is it more important than all the book of the prophets? Mashiach will come. All other books will not be considered important. Only the book of Esther, which doesn't even have God's name once. God's name is alluded to if you take the first letter of various words or the last letter of various words in Megillah in a row, so you have God's name. Mihu Zeh who. In other words, in Megillah, on the other hand, what you see clearly in the Megillah is a story about Gentiles. And that story about the Gentiles, about Achashverosh and Haman, that's going to be important to be read about and learned and studied even after Mashiach comes. And not only have to say the story of that's pertinent to Jewish people, you have to read the whole story of Achashverosh as well. Why is that so important? Okay, in Tzarech Lemer, we have to say, there must be something about the book of Esther which is surpassing when Islam and Gimel, if you want to Islam and Gimel. There must be something with the book of Esther that surpasses all of the other books of the prophets and all other parts of the Torah, because therefore, even as Mashiach will come, it's considered something which is novel, something which is unusual. So we need to understand what exactly is there in this book of Esther that makes it stand out of all the other books of the Torah. Because Esther, to understand what's so great about Esther. On the contrary, you have to look at the halacha we just mentioned, where the story starts from. I see the story about Achashverosh, how he ruled over 127 lands, and how in the third year of his reign he made a party. And the story about Vashti, that's a separate story. No one understood at the moment that the story took place that had any relevance at all to the Jewish people. There was another story that happened to the Jewish people. There's a decree against them, and they fast, and they did what they could according to the rules of nature, and they succeeded in nullifying the decree. That's a different story. That's the way things seemed. So if it wouldn't be in the Megillah, you would think that there's two different stories. There's a story about Achashverosh and his party, and there's another story how there's a decree against the Jewish people, and they did various things to annul the decree. They fasted, they did tshuva, Esther went to Achashverosh. So that's a different story. That's how you would think before the Megillah was written. But once the Megillah was written, you can get Esther Megillah Shagaza Gufa and Nekash Baruch Hashem Mesiviv as Dvarim Beifne Kam Shom Kinkel Chinim Achashverosh Akol Kum Zamdinis Achashverosh Sam Elok Mishta Sam Sedarim Beifne Shavashti Yitzer Love. When you read the Megillah, you discover That the whole point of Achashverosh, of Hashem arranging the world in a way that a few years before this, Achashverosh should become the king. And he should decide to take a party. And he should invite his wife and show her not wanting to appear. All of this is only for the sake of the Jewish people. When you see this in the full context of the whole story, you discover that this actually was put in place in order to help the Jewish people. Megalim lanu, Hashem reveals to us, whether you understand it or not, in order for the Jewish people to be victorious over the anti-Semites, Achashverosh had to be the king of the entire world from Haidu until Kush. And if Achashverosh would not be the king of the entire world, then this transformation would not take place. The whole point was that the Jewish people in the entire world should be able to be victorious over the anti-Semites. And in order to make this happen, Hashem orchestrated years before the decree even happened that Achashverosh should become the king, and he should make a party, and Vashti should want to come. And through this, Esther became the queen, and the miracle happens. Uluchura, kasha medubar edis amach fuzum for binamim chakash baruch latas latrichas malchei sharis. It's called seder shtalshel, called seder teva. Last is Achashverosh mentioned next page. The keeper shul zara chaklis is galgal shalom mish kam shanim. Shekorach gam muhammed the fei kin bavel achin ucher kesh kulu. It seems if there's just one little nation that's scattered among all nations, why does Hashem have to bother all the angels, bother the entire spiritual cosmos, bother the entire arrangement that he has in nature to make Achashverosh become the king of the world, and to arrange things years in advance, and to make which Achashverosh's reign was connected with many wars. First the war with Babylonia, then the war with Koresh. Hashem there could have been a much easier way for Hashem to arrange all this. So indeed, it's not something we can understand. It's wondrous. But nevertheless, the halacha is where must you begin reading the story to do the mitzvah of reading the story? Cool, you have to read the whole story. That the story of Purim begins with Achashverosh becoming the king of the whole world. Even though the events of Purim happened years later. Megillah Esther, this is a novelty that Megillah Esther teaches us. The story of Megillah does not begin with the salvation. It doesn't begin with Achashverosh giving a new edict. The Jewish people are allowed to fight against their enemies. You can't have the transformation of the Jewish people, instead of being annihilated by their enemies, to being victorious over their enemies. You can't reach that story unless you read the whole entire Megillah. If you read the story only with Achashverosh first becoming the king of the whole world, can the Jewish people eventually be victorious over their enemies. You might think that you could do things in a better way. In other words, that there's a lot easier ways for this to happen. But God testifies to the Torah that He knows what He's doing. He made the world, and the only reason why He made Achashverosh to become the king, and the only reason why Achashverosh made the party, and the only reason why all this happened was all orchestrated for the sake of an apachu, so the Jewish people in the entire world should be victorious over their enemies. So in short, what we learned so far is that it seems that there's parts of Megillah which aren't relevant, and why do we need to know about Achashverosh? Why do we need to know about the party? Why do we need to know about Vashti? And that's what we would think if that wasn't in the story of the Megillah. We would think the whole story was that there was a Haman who wanted to destroy us. But the truth is that the goal of the story of Purim is that we should be victorious over our enemies, that there should be the victory of the Jewish people against the anti-Semites. To reach that victory, that total and all-encompassing victory, Hashem orchestrated events in the world years before there was a decree against the Jewish people. So, so what you're seeing is that although we don't understand it, that's something which is logical to our minds, but that's the way Hashem made the world. Hashem made the world in a way that and we could see it, that all these events that happened in the world prior to the decree against the Jewish people, all for the sake of the story of Purim, which is what we're going to realize, it seems, after Mashiach comes. When we realize that the whole reason why there was a Putin, why there was a fight with the Ukraine, why all that, that's going to be part of and how did Mashiach come? It's all these things are part of the story. It's not something which is, it's not, you seem to fight, or you want to have the Ukraine part. Mashiach comes, we'll see how this is all part of the story. It's all for the sake of Bias and Mashiach. Esther and falsafar, it makes sense?
Yes.
Okay, this is Esther's request. Write me down for all generations. There's not just a lesson time of Purim, it's for all generations, and every generation a Jew asks this question. Although there's a big world, a Jew is told you have to go against the world. But even when the Jew is told, the reason you exist is not to anger Gentiles. Although there's a big world and you have to go against the world, don't think that you're there to make everyone else angry. That you're there and you're bothering the existence of the world. Rather, your existence is the main one. And the whole world rests upon you. As the Talmud says on the verse, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Says the Talmud, why was the world created? For the sake of the Jewish people. For two ratios, two things which are called beginning, two things which are called first. That's why God made the world. He made the world for the sake of Israel, for the sake of the Jewish people, and for the sake of Torah, for the sake of the Jewish people keeping the Torah. So that's why the world is here. It's not that your existence is a contrary to the world's existence. The contrary, the world's here for you. The Rambam writes in his introduction to the Mishnah that he tries to explain the words of the Talmud. The whole world was created for the sake of this one, for the sake of. I think the Rambam says the world was created for the sake of the wise man, the Talmud Chacham. So Rambam says, so the wise man should not be sad. Rambam writes that a person is social, and he'd be alone, he'd be sad, and a person's very needy, and there's many things he needs. If the wise man would be here by himself, he would have to know how to plow and plant and how to reap and how to grind and how to bake. He would have to know how to weave and how to sew. And when we have time, when would the wise man ever have time to learn wisdom? And therefore, there are other people in the world do all these things for him. And in order that the wise man should have everything that he needs. That's the Rambam writes. So this is just an example, the Rebbe says, of what happens in the world, but doesn't explain it. It doesn't make sense that the whole world should run just for the sake of this one guy. He just one in quantity. He's just one individual. What's the point? Just he shall enter us. Therefore, there are 7 billion people to help him. Quick and Megillah. That's a question you could ask about the world. A Jew could ask about the world. Similarly, the person can ask about himself. If we count all the hours of the day, the rest of the sikha outside. We count the hours of the day, and you look at your lifestyle, you look at how your day runs, how many hours you dedicate to sleep, how many hours dedicate to eat and drink and for your health, and how many hours you dedicate for your business. And we're not talking about wicked people. We're talking about a Jew who acts in sync with the code of Jewish law. And God says in the Torah, God will bless you in all that you do. And you must gather your grain and wine and oil. And the Talmud says that many people tried to do what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, not to go to work, and they weren't successful. And many of them did what Rabbi Shmuel said to go to work, and they were successful. So if you count all those hours, And especially, you count the time of your youth, before you became obligated to keep the Torah mitzvahs. You'll discover that very little of your life is dedicated to Torah mitzvahs, but most of the time is dedicated to things which are secondary. And therefore, a person asks, why do I have to read the whole Megillah? It would be better to start with the transformation of the decree to good. It would be better that God should create me at the age of our mitzvah. It would be better if God would exempt me from eating and drinking and sleeping and doing business, and give me the possibility, if I want, to study Torah and do mitzvahs without doing anything else. Not doing anything else that the Torah says I'm allowed to do. It would be much better if I could just dedicate myself to Torah mitzvahs without the need for eating and sleeping and business. And the answer to this is that God gives the answer. That God created a Jew to be a soul and a body. Before the soul was in this world, that was indeed the order. That all the soul was involved in was serving God. As it says in the verse of a prophet testifies, God is alive who I stood before him. The prophet is talking about his time in heaven. He says, God is alive who I stood before him. And when it says he stood before God, what the Talmud explains that he's referring to his prayers to God. And that's what happens now with the angels. The angels are now standing in the presence of God and praying to God. But the Torah was not given to angels. The world was not created for the sake of angels. The Torah was created for the sake of Jews, and in what kind of Jew, the way the soul descends into this world. So when a Jew asks, what connection do I have to the story of Achashverosh? I'm only connected to the end of the story. The Jewish people have light and joy and gladness and honor. Light means Torah. Joy means Yantiv. Gladness is also refers to Mitzvah Bris Milah. Honor refers to Tefillin. That's what I'm about. I'm about Torah mitzvahs. Why are you schlepping me? Why are you pulling me to be connected to the story of Achashverosh? So the halacha is, and then the Jew is told, in order to do the Mitzvah Megillah, you have to read the entire story. Only if you have the entire story can the things be transformed to good. You hear what I was saying? I was saying that it's not just a necessary evil that Hashem has created, that you have to go through A, B, and C. That is part of the story. That's part of the story of Torah mitzvahs. Hashem doesn't just want the Torah mitzvahs. He wants all of the things that he created, that and all the events in your life that lead to Torah mitzvahs. That's all part of the story. And this, okay. So I don't think we'll be able to finish what I wanted to finish. But let's, in short, what did we learn today? Unbelievable thing we learned today. Unbelievable. There's an argument in the Talmud. Where do you have to read in the Megillah to fulfill the mitzvah? There are 4 opinions. You have to read this part of the story, that part of the story. And the conclusion is you have to read the whole story. And the Rebbe's question is, why read the whole story? The point of the story is that we won and that we're victorious. Why have to go through all the other parts? And so the answer is that we have to realize that Hashem orchestrated all the events in the world for the sake of the Torah mitzvahs, for the sake of the Jewish people. Even the things which seem to have no relevance at all to the Jewish people, they're also for the sake of the Jewish people. And that's why the Megillah begins with Achashverosh coming to power and Vashti being killed, to tell us that this is the way things are in every generation. Whatever is going on in the world, it may seem there's no connection at all to your life, but it's not that way. And it doesn't make sense that there's a whole big world. It doesn't make sense. Not something we could understand, but this is the fact that Hashem, we could see that all these events that happened, the war with Achashverosh, that he had to become the king, and other wars of Babylonia and Koresh, all those things, were for the sake of the story of the Jewish people to have light and joy, gladness, and honor. Although it would seem that there are a lot easier ways to accomplish this. Yes, but yet that's how God made the world. That everything that's created in the world, this big world is huge, big world, and yet it's for the sake of Torah and the sake of the Jewish people, mitzvahs. And so similarly, on a personal level, you might think that your story is only about the joy and gladness and honor. Your story is only about Torah mitzvahs, Milah and Yantiv, and why have to all the other stuff for? Why have to have all the other stuff in your life? It seems that most of our lives is dedicated to things which are unimportant. And therefore, the Megillah tells us you have to know that there's a big story out there. Yes, the point of the story the point of the story is correct. But in order to get to the point of the story, Hashem knows what he's doing in his world, and he makes all these events that happen in the world, and all events happening in your life, and they're all part of the story for it, all part of the story of Megillah. The questions, comments, criticism, tomatoes, cucumbers.